mahajanapads, that is the kingdoms in ancient India. We have already read that some 3000 years ago that janapads were coming into the picture. But what happened after that? Some 500 years later, that is 2500 years ago, the mahajanapads came into existence. As we all know that the agriculture was grooming, the people were settling down in an area. Hence the janapads, which were becoming more important than others, they started being called as the mahajanapads, with most having a capital city. Many of these were fortified, that is, there were several forts being made, and as we all know that to make a fort there we should have huge walls, we should have more bricks, we should have stones and all the things that are required to make a strong fort. According to Anguttara Nikaya, that is a Buddhist text, there were 16 mahajanapads in the Indian subcontinent. As per this particular map, we see the famous ones like Gandhar, which is also known as Kandahar in present day Afghanistan. The other one is Kuru, also called as the Kurukshetra. Then Panchal, Kaushal, Magad, Ang, Vajji, or also called as Vrija, and then Avanti are some of the famous mahajanapads of those era. And apart from that, yes, we had several janapads too. Forts are a good way to save the people from the external attacks. We also know that those kings were making forts to show off the strength and power that they had. And also it meant an easy control over the subjects. That is, by making forts, the king used to be easily controlling the subjects of the Mahajanpad. Building a fort meant a great deal of planning. You require a good amount of engineers, you require architects, you require all kind of people who are required to build a fort. Enormous labor was required, that is men, women and children, and also resources, that is the bricks, stones, mortars, etc. On the left hand side we see a photograph. Here it's a fortification of a wall at Kaushambi near Allahabad, Uttar Pradesh. Here we see the remains of 2500 years old structure, that is a Mahajanpad. Here we see a person who's cleaning off this huge wall. We also see that the new Rajas who were now becoming the kings of these Mahajanpads, they began maintaining big armies. These new Rajas now began maintaining huge armies, that is, the soldiers were now paid regular salaries and maintained by the king throughout the year. Some payment were probably made using punch-marked coins. For example, we have a punch-marked coin here. We see some kind of graffitis being made, some graffitis being punched on this metal thing. The emergence of Janpads and Mahajanpads signified the birth of geography in Indian history. We all know that in the Vedic times, people were wanderers. They were pastoral people. They used to live a nomadic life in search of food. Their affiliation was only towards the tribe in those eras in which they used to live. But with the passage of time, people developed ways of and means to earn a source of livelihood by practicing agriculture. As they used to go for agriculture, they used to grow food, they started engaging themselves in the production of food too, and this meant a settled life. We all knew that in the Vedic period, cattle was quite important. They used to fight for cattle. But now, cattle was no more considered a major strength of wealth. The cattle raids of the preceding period were now replaced by organized campaigns. See this word, organized campaigns, in which territory was annexed. Now the territory was more important than the cattle like the previous Vedic ages, and the agriculturalists and craftsmen were to pay taxes. That is, these people were now paying the taxes to the king or the Raja of this era. Initially such system wasn't there, or was there to a little extent only. Now the money economy had surpassed the barter system. The barter system started declining. As we know that the people of the kings of these Mahajanpads were making huge forts and walls. They were fortifying everything. Hence, we know that to To maintain huge forts, to maintain huge armies, Mahajanapads needed more resources, and they needed officials to collect these taxes too for for these purposes. So instead of depending on the occasional gifts that these kings were getting by these people, as in the case of Rajas of Janapads, which was already existing at that time too, they started collecting regular taxes. That is, a professional network was created of collecting the taxes, which was a good way around to have a good revenue system. Taxes on crops was a major revenue source at that time, as we know that people were engaged in farming activities. Usually the tax was fixed at 1 by 6th of what was produced at that time. So if at all you're producing 100 kg of, let's say, wheat or rice, out of that 1 by 6th was to be given to the king. This was known as a bhag or a share. That is, you have to provide your share to the king. There were taxes on craft people too, that is, the craftsmen too. They could have been in the form of labor. For example, a weaver or a blacksmith may have to work for a day or every month for the king. That is, he may have to go and he may have to, for example, a smith or, for example, a weaver, he may have to stitch a cloth, or he may have to made a cloth for the king, or maybe the queen, or maybe the noble people inside the fort who are known to the king. The herders were also expected to pay the taxes, although they were wanderers, but yes, they were expected to pay the taxes in the form of animals and animal produce. So they may be providing the woolen cloth, or they may be providing the wool, or let's say the dairy product or flesh to the king in form of taxes. There were also taxes on goods that were brought and sold through the trade. As we all know that inside a city, or let's say it is a fort being made, and this was the gate, and let's say the traders used to come. As we all know that traders were a common scenario in the olden cities. The traders used to come and pass through the city. So whosoever trader is coming inside, he has to pay a tax to the king. Also, the hunter-gatherers also had to provide forest produce to the Raja. Although they were not the direct subjects of the king, but still, as they were using the resources of the Mahajanpad, that is the city, they had to provide forest produce like fruits or any kind of birds or some flesh or some animals to the king in the form of tax. So king was not putting any stone unturned to collect the taxes. In this time, there were changes in the agriculture too. There were two major changes in agriculture that we found this time, that is some 3000 years ago to 2000 years ago. This was the time when we saw that agriculture was also changing. Unlike before, when there was no agriculture or little agriculture, this time things were changing. The growing use of iron plowshare. We all knew that in the previous era, 3000 years ago, only wooden plow was used. This is a wooden plow. As the technology was growing and people were getting to know that there are discovery of metal, and hence in such a case the wooden plow was made into an iron plow. You can see in this diagram that a plowshare, that is the front part which gets digged into the ground, the plowshare was made via the iron. This meant that heavy clay soil could be turned over better than with a wooden plowshare, so that more grain could be produced. Now the soil could be upturned easily. With the use of plowshare and introduction of iron, people decided to settle down in one place and practice agriculture. Yes, this was also a reason to have a growing population inside Mahajanapads and Janapads in those era. And the second advantage, or the second change, the major change that we saw in agriculture was the beginning of transplantation of paddy. Initially, the paddy or the rice seeds used to be scattered. The farmer used to scatter them by hands on the ground. But from now on, people discovered that transplantation was a good option to grow paddy, from which the plants would sprout. Saplings were grown and then planted in the fields. This led to increased production as many more plants survived. Transplantation is a process in which we grow paddy in a small area and in close proximity. We can see that all this green area that we see here and being planted by these people, it's it's after a month or so it gets transplanted to the fields where there is waterlogged, and then selected saplings only were taken to grow, and then we have to have an increased production as many more plants survived. But no doubt this was a back-breaking work. The people who used to work in fields, they had to, usually it was the slaves or the women or the children who used to work in field in those times.